Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boos. In this episode, we're going to be looking at CompTIA's Project Plus. Specifically, we'll be explaining risk strategies and activities. So here with us today, we have Mr. Ronnie Wong. Thank you for being here today, Ronnie.
Well, thank you for having me back as we take a look at this idea of risk management. We want to make sure that we understand the importance of being able to manage risk well. And in that way, we are going to talk about some of the strategies dealing with the idea of risks and, of course, some of the activities that we can do to help us to identify risks a bit quicker and to be able to understand what impact that they have, as well as what we're going to end up seeing, how we as project managers are going to be able to make decisions based on the activities that we do as well. So that is what we're planning on for this particular episode. So stay tuned as we continue on to take a look at the ideas. Now, if you've already been through any type of project management training, you've had kind of the fundamentals that we're going through today. But we, of course, want you to be ready for the exam as well, so we're going to take you through that too. So let's make sure that we understand. Remember that a lot of times, especially on this exam, the terminology is going to be important, so make sure you also pay attention to terminologies if the actual contents sound incredibly familiar to you. So that's where we're going to begin and take a look, and then we'll talk about some other things that we need to know as well. Okay?
Yeah, Ronnie, I was going to go ahead and ask you, in other types of training or certification that you may have studied, we might have looked at some risk mitigation and so forth. So are there any kinds of specific risks that are associated with project management that we should be aware of?
Well, when it comes down to project management, it's kind of a little bit unusual because of the way that we tend to define risk in security types of environments, right? When you move into the realm of IT security, when you hear the term risk, okay, it's never really mentioned in a positive light. But in project management, though, risk actually does have the tone of there being something in which is normally bad, but there can also be where you can infer something good from it as well. So a lot of times what we have to be able to do as project managers then is to make sure that we can identify the differences in terms of risk, whether they're considered something positive or whether they're negative as well, and we're going to associate some words with those. So let's take a look at my screen as we talk about some of these concepts. So the first thing that we want to understand is that in project management, there are what we call risk threats, and normally that brings on a negative connotation, okay, for what we actually are talking about. And so when we start thinking about the idea of a risk threat, we are normally thinking about things like vulnerabilities, okay, that we actually have to worry about. So a vulnerability, for example, that's a risk, is that we rely on a contractor, right? But the contractor that we've been dealing with, let's say, for example, has just retired and they've now sold it out to a new company. The contract, they say, is still good and still exists. Well, that could actually be a risky thing to say, I've never dealt with this particular contractor, even though that person has now bought this firm out and we're willing to deal with them. So you might actually take a look at that, and that might become a threat to your project if you don't know that person that's actually there, you don't trust fully yet what they can do. Not saying it can't turn out to be an opportunity at the same time, but that's normally what we also have to understand as well. Okay? Along with that, of course, then, when we start talking about risk management and some of the other things that we have to deal with, risk management not only has to do with identifying those things as the threats and opportunities, but also analyzing their potential. And we're going to get into the realm of quantitative and qualitative risk analysis. Now, if those terms sound like kind of, whoa, we're talking in terms we don't normally speak in, you're probably right, but we'll break it down for you and we'll talk about that. We're not going to get into the most technical understanding of everything, but we'll at least show you examples of them as well.
And for the remainder of the terms that you do have on your display there, Ronnie, a lot of those, if you guys are studying for other certifications like Security Plus, they probably look eerily similar. Hint, hint.
Yep. Yeah, no, there's no doubt that you'll actually see these terms. And the reason why is that risk itself, okay, when we deal with them, okay, the key here is not to deal with them any way that we feel, okay. The key word here, believe it or not, is actually this particular adjective right here, okay, or adverb, I should say, appropriately responding, okay. We can all deal with risk, okay, in any fashion that we want to, okay. The problem is that a lot of those fashions, the way that we deal with risk, they're inappropriate ways that we deal with risk, okay? We can run off and throw a tantrum, okay? We can run off and slug somebody right in the jaw. That doesn't necessarily mitigate anything of risk that you have. But what we're talking about here, of course, is the appropriate manner in responding to the risk that end up happening to your project. So the key, first of all, then, is to identify whether we're talking about a risk or a threat or an opportunity in terms of risk, okay? And then from that point, here's usually how it breaks down, okay? In terms of opportunities, we may transfer that risk, okay? We may say, all right, I don't have the time to deal with it right now, but I see this as a potential opportunity, and I want to ensure that for my future. So it may be where you invest in something a little bit later on, and what are you doing? You're putting essentially a down payment towards that if you want to do something. Okay? The other ones are what we call exploit and enhance. And even though I've got them separated out as two different lines here, they're kind of very similar. Okay? The idea of taking advantage of whatever opportunity it is that's presented. Now, at the same time, even though we might see them as being an opportunity for our future, other people may see them as being a threat as well. So you might take advantage of an opportunity where somebody that is what we call risk adverse says, no way, I would never touch that. If you're risk neutral, or you're actually one of those people that enjoys being risk active, or what do they call it? I can't remember the actual proper term, that loves risk, embraces the idea of risk here.
Fortune favors the bold.
Yeah, fortune favors the bold here. Yeah, that type of thing, you may choose to go ahead and exploit that. In other words, take advantage of it now and actually even do everything you can to enhance the fact that that risk may happen. Most of us, though, take a look at risk as being negative. So usually for us, in terms of the way that we appropriately respond to them, we may talk about the idea of avoidance, or just stay out of it as well. We have to accept it because there's really nothing else we can do. And then we can even mention the idea of mitigation to minimize as much as we can when dealing with these different activities. So a lot of times you may want to actually take a look at this. Okay? So the idea of avoidance here, okay, you may actually just say, all right, in terms of just avoiding, you don't deal with the risk. So if you think about something like that, okay, you have to kind of go, okay, I didn't deal with it, but we'll accept it as it comes along. So let's give a very realistic example of something that may happen on a project site. Okay? You go, look, we've tried within a 100-mile radius to rent every single generator that will give me 50,000 volt or watts or above, okay? And there's none available. They can't be here in time for what we need it, okay, to actually be. So instead, what do? You just kind of go, okay, if power goes out, it goes out, okay, and that's what you have.
Get two smaller generators.
Yeah, hopefully you can get two smaller generators, but what if you can't? You know, what? In other words, what if those are actually gone? So at this point, you just kind of accept the risk. Now, I even have a smaller example, which is fairly easy, a little bit more personal. It helps us to understand the idea of just accepting risk. And that's when you go, look, I know a hurricane's coming through, but I'm just going to stay put, okay? You're actively saying that I don't care what the hurricane brings, I'm just going to stay put. And at that particular point in time, if you talk about the idea of power, you're staying put until the power actually comes back on, for you to do something. So that could be it. When you talk about the idea of mitigation, that's when you go to generators as well, where you go, I know what I'm going to do. Next time a power outage happens, I'm going to buy a generator. And that way, power goes out, I have a generator on hand. That's the idea of mitigation as well. So there are different examples that you can take a look at when you start dealing with this idea of taking a look at the idea of responding and what we end up doing with this. Now, as easy as that sounds, right? Okay? Those are all good things that we can understand, and we've got to keep these things in our mind as we start to deal with them. But sometimes, though, it's not as easy to identify. Okay? It's not as very quick, and the scenarios don't come to your mind as quickly. Sometimes they're actually technically challenging to be able to understand whether it's something that I need to deal with immediately, or whether it's something I can put off, whether I need to go ahead and get insurance now, or do I need to do it a little bit later on. So what can you do at that particular point when you start to take a look here? Okay? Well, this is when you get into the realm of analysis a little bit more. And the idea of analysis is simple, breaking it down into the smallest components that gives us a measurable and an understandable idea of what we're dealing with. Okay? And in that sense, in terms of risk, we tend to always break it down into what we call a quantitative analysis or a qualitative analysis. And I've broken it down into 4 areas when you want to compare them versus one another when we start talking about in terms of project management. So here, at the very beginning, when we start to break this down, quantitative analysis versus qualitative, its overall scope is pretty much the key aspect of this as well. Okay? When you're dealing with it per risk, okay, you're taking a look at it essentially scenario by scenario. Okay? Every risk, you are trying to determine that. And that is what we call a qualitative type of analysis that we'll do. But if you're trying to determine the risk and what this does to your entire project here, you're probably going to go for more quantitative analysis. And we'll talk about what that really means at the end here. Okay? The basis of qualitative analysis is essentially subjective, whereas quantitative is data-driven or data-based. And that means they take a bunch of numbers and we crunch those numbers together, and the numerical product that we get from those numbers, okay, gives us the ability to then create what we call a risk rating. Okay, a lot of times, then we can take that and compare it to other types of risk, and we can now actually have them on comparison chart as well. Okay? The other thing, of course, is the effort that it takes for you to do this. Okay? When you're only doing it scenario by scenario, the effort of this is actually relatively easy and fast, of taking a look and going, all right, here it is, Cherokee. We're in the last month of hurricane season. We watched the National Weather Service. 3 hurricanes are projected to come through. Okay? Well, then Cherokee can start coming up with scenarios on her task and saying, what is it that I need to understand here as far as a risk goes, and how do we actually deal with it at that point?
Incorporating past experiences, any kind of knowledge about the situation.
Yeah, and dealing with everything that you tend to deal with, but on a smaller scale here, qualitative analysis works just as well, and it doesn't take the time that quantitative analysis does. Because with numbers, right, you have to factor in a lot of different variables before the numbers mean anything. It's the same thing with things like polling data. If you have a small sample in poll, don't get me wrong, you can work with some things, but the larger the sampling is, the more reliable that particular number is going to be. And the same thing here. If you want to talk about influences, remember, a single number can make a change in whatever you're doing. And that's why quantitative analysis is time consuming. It takes a lot of time gathering the data. It takes a lot of time, at least for me, because I'm no math whiz, to crunch through those numbers. And regardless of the tools that I have on hand, even data entry is a little bit hard for me. And you'll see as we go through some examples of this in just a moment. Okay? In terms of tools, it requires really you to work through scenarios, okay? And you to talk this out and maybe write down a few figures and your pro and con list of things. But on this one, it may actually require a special type of tool. In other words, there are actually risk generators out there, okay, that really do crunch the numbers and take into effect variables, even location, time of the year, the climate and the condition, depending on what you're working in. If you need something like that, you may actually have to take advantage of it, which requires you to either rent that particular type of software, or for you to actually buy some type of software like that as well. So in all of that, you actually do need to understand, as a project manager, at least the basis of how these numbers are determined and the way that they're determined. If you're making a full judgment for the entire project, trust a quantitative analysis, okay? If you're coming up on a situation in which you go, I really can't determine the risk very easily because there's not enough data available for me to do so, then qualitative analysis is probably going to be the way to go, because that's going to get you the numbers, or going to get you at least to that point where you can make a decision quicker.
Or even if you're a greenhorn and you just don't have that extra experience and you're not really sure, you can fall back on that factual component there with the quantitative information to help you make the decision until you do gain that experience as well.
True. Okay, so let's take a look at both here. Okay, so let's talk about this idea of qualitative analysis briefly, and let me show you this idea of qualitative analysis. So let's take a look at my screen again as we move through. Okay, in qualitative analysis, when we talk about risk, we're really trying to determine 2 things, okay, that really hit us in terms of risk. Okay, one is the idea of probability. Okay, so for us, we can talk about the rate of occurrence if we want to actually take a look at that. Okay. So that one is not judged on a scale yet, okay, except for high to low. So you might have people that rate it as high and then medium and low, low, medium, high, or you might even have people that are a little bit more, structured and breakdown. Medium, high, low to medium, and then medium, and don't get me wrong, you can break this down as much as you want to. Me, I'm fairly simple. You see where I just put low and high, okay? And the same thing with impact. Very difficult to understand this idea of impact, okay, overall. But somebody that is qualitatively driven right now for whatever scenario that we actually have, we may choose then to actually make a fairly simple type of what we call risk matrix that helps us to identify this idea of risk, okay? So let's say that we have 4 different scenarios here, Cherokee, okay? And so the way that we do this is something like this, okay? Notice I didn't try to divide it up into 19 squares and, a bunch of different things. I just simply went ahead and just made a square out of this.
You saw my earlier chart, so that's not fair.
Oh, yeah. Well, but this is just a brief example here, okay? So, of course, when you start to take a look at this, right? So what you do is you go ahead and you divide it up like this. In this quadrant over here on the left-hand side, low probability, low impact, okay? Well, that to me means low risk,
right,
okay, is what I would actually tend to think about, okay? But notice as we move up here on the left-hand side, okay, low impact and high probability, right? Notice we're still in the low side of the impact, and now high probability over here.
Older equipment, but it's okay because you have a backup.
Yeah,
That's
something
my
like
thought.
that. Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we can do something like that. Okay. And then, of course, over here on the right-hand side, low probability, high impact is something else that we can have. And then, of course, high probability, high impact.
This is going to be your line of business type application.
Sure. Yeah. Very good, Cherokee. Yeah, it's still on my thunder. Why don't you? No, that's fine. That will actually work out for us. But it kind of lets you know, at least at the most basic, right? Don't get me wrong, you can get a PhD in risk management, okay? This is not the PhD, this is kind of the high school, high school intro to the idea of risk management. But think about doing something like this here. So let me see if I can actually get it to do what I want to do. I've never been able to really get this. I love this tool. A little bit hard to work with, but I really do love it because it's so graphic, okay? So in this sense, so let's say, let me give Cherokee an example here, okay? And so what I want you to think about is probability and impact, okay?
Okay.
So let's use the example of a comet hitting the IT Pro TV studios, okay? If you were to talk about that in terms of probability.
Bottom right quadrant.
Okay, yeah. Now, how did you arrive at that bottom right quadrant, okay? What did you say in terms of probability?
I've never heard of a giant meteor hitting IT Pro TV before, so I'm going to go by that.
Okay, so in other words, low probability is what we're thinking.
Low probability,
okay?
exactly.
Yeah, because as many things that hit, the Earth's atmosphere, a lot of it burns up. But let's say a giant meteor, that's the risk. Okay, well, let's say low probability, but a meteor hitting IT Pro TV studio, the impact is pretty high. Okay, so let's say we'll actually just put a mark out here. Okay, make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So now, let's go ahead and take a look at something else happening, okay? I have a 10-year-old generator, okay, that has worked very well, but it is 10 years old, and there's, let's say, 3,000 hours on this particular generator, and its mean time between failure, okay, is at 9,500 hours, okay? But I have a backup generator. What do you think as far as the risk goes?
Top left quadrant.
Top left
For
quadrant?
200, please.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So let's just go ahead and put that up here. Okay. So that's something like that can actually happen as well. Okay. Now let's do something a little bit stranger. Okay. Let's just talk about the idea of weather. Okay. So if I sit there and go, oh, today is a beautiful day. I don't think it's going to rain, so I should be able to pour my concrete. Okay. What do you think?
Well, unless you're in like Kansas or somewhere really unpredictable.
We're in Florida, okay?
Bottom left quadrant.
Yeah, I think so. So I'm trying to make this relatively easy, so we'll do that, okay?
All right, no curveballs.
Yeah, hopefully no curveballs, okay? The chances now of Ronnie actually saying a sentence without stuttering, okay? Yeah, let's just put that one up here, okay? So we'll do that.
I'm with you. I
Yeah.
feel you. Yeah.
But what you start doing is what? You take all the risks that are in that immediate time period or whatever scenario, and all of a sudden you start to do what? You just start to mark them, you know, however you want to. And then, you know, you start to find out that there's a number of risks in certain areas, and all of a sudden this actually tells you if you actually want to put a rating on this, like here are the ones I know I definitely have to have some plan of action for, okay? Here's the ones I really don't have a plan of action for because the probability is low of it happening, okay? Even though its impact is insanely high.
We
okay?
might need to just address them.
Yeah,
and
we
see
may just need to say, all right, we'll address that at some point, okay?
Okay.
Low probability, low impact, I may not do anything at all, okay? So then that helps me out, and then of course high up, you kind of get the idea. You may after time move things around, oops, I try to, oops.
Big problem.
Yeah, so now, yeah, you may actually after a while find out that a lot of this stuff really actually ended up over here. So this gives you that qualitative type of analysis. Notice we didn't make any figures or anything dealing with that idea
No,
to
fairly
try
easy,
and
fast.
yeah, fairly easy, fairly fast, allowing us to do what we need to. So you can see something like this where it really does help out. Okay. Now the other thing though, okay, so just doing something like that is fairly easy, and that's why we talk about qualitative analysis as being easy. Okay. Now the other thing that we also need to take a look at then, of course, is what we call a quantitative analysis type of example. Okay. Now in this, okay, I've actually got two different ones here. I've got an opportunity and I've got risk. Okay. So here, what I've done is I've assigned a value. Now, where the heck did this value come from? It depends on whatever scale that you're using. Okay. So I just used from a 0 to 1. Okay, is what I did. Okay. Now, once I did that, there's probably some formulas you can come up with to help you out, but this is how I actually assign it. Risk A, probably happening, let's say it was 50% chance. Okay. Impact, about 30%, and that gives me a risk score. Makes sense?
Yep.
Same thing with all the rest of these. Okay. So I actually went ahead and added these up because I didn't want you to see me trying to actually, you know, figure out the math here as I
squint to look at the screen.
yeah, that's right, to do that. Same thing with the idea of probability, okay? So having all that stuff on hand really does help us out. And you might be wondering, what are we going to do with this data, okay? So now, same thing that we did before in terms of the risk matrix here, what I can actually do now, hopefully I can do this, okay?
Triage.
Yeah, you can triage it, but this is the way that you also do this, but a little bit more quantitatively instead. Notice we're still dealing with the ideas of probability
I'm still
and
trying
impact.
to have my eyes adjust to that.
Yeah, it's a little bright. Isn't it? Stop picking on me. All right,
I
so
know.
there we go. So I have on one side the idea of threats, and on the other side opportunities here. Okay, this gives you that same ability. So instead, I wrote this down so that we could see it here. So for risk A, the risk score was 0.15. So that's going to be a threat because I called it a risk instead of an opportunity. And I'll have to change this to something we can see on this board here. So we'll do that, and we'll do that. Hopefully this will make sense. So 0.15, let's say it's down here.
Plot it out.
Yep, you plot it out, okay? For B, 0.16, I don't know if that's actually true, but we'll do that. And then for C here, it was a 1. So a 1 and a 1. There you go. Okay, so we were able to do that. So there it is. So I've got 3, and then D was 0.375. So 0.375, let's say it's somewhere around here. Okay, now I could have actually done it a little bit differently where what I had was probability was 0.75, and then you go up to 0.5 here instead, which is probably what I should have done with these instead of trying to do that. So let's say 0.5 is here, and then this one was 0.75. So that's what that, oops, let me see if I can do that. So I needed that number, and then the second one I did the wrong one again. So this was actually where the impact was actually very high, like that. At least that's what I'm hoping. Okay? So now you can take a look and realize that what do you do? So you do the same thing with the opportunities. We're not going to worry about that one so much so. But realize that you do what? You actually have something that you definitely need to address in the red area. something right here in terms of probability in this kind of mustard
Provide
area.
that visual. Now
Yep.
the colors, it all makes sense. It's all coming together.
Yeah, isn't that weird? Yeah. I mean, it's like I actually did something
You
that I
thought
knew
about
about.
it,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
something like that. So the same thing then. So if you do have something like that where you start generating this, so let's just do one or two of them over here on the other side, and we'll change this color to make it black. I guess that's kind of weird, but why not? Okay. I'm trying to pick a color I didn't actually have in this in my matrix here. So A is actually 0.18, and the way that I have that is that the probability is about 0.6, but the impact is about 0.3. Oops. So there it is. Oops, let me get the right thing. So that would be here. And then the same thing with B, which is the whatever I had. Probability was 0.11, which is very low. Actually, yeah, 1.1. But then the actual impact of it was very high. So that way you can actually compare and contrast your threats and your opportunities. And you might find out that if you have something like this where it's actually right up here in this red, you go, that's an opportunity I definitely need to take advantage of at that particular point. And that's when you decide whether you're going to exploit it, enhance it, or even transfer the risk over to what you need to. So those are kind of the basic examples.
Good tools.
When we start to take a look at the idea here of trying to get that understanding of what you do in terms of risk analysis, at a very basic level. There are many more tools that are actually available for us, but that's where it actually begins, and when you start to see that as well. Okay. Now, along with this, what are some of the other tools that we definitely need to make sure that we are also taking a look at as well? Okay. Well, in project management, you deal in the realm of what we call, of course, risk planning. Okay. Now, when you start talking about risk planning, you're looking for what we call risk triggers and monitoring for them. And this is the idea of setting up some type of early warning. And this really happens with basic communication, but also with different events, right? As people start turning in information. So we've done shows on the using project constraints. I couldn't remember what show we just did here. We talked about the idea of using project constraints. That sometimes what a particular trigger might be, believe it or not, is something just as simple as a consistent underspending of the budget. Now, even though the majority of us would go, I would thankfully have everybody underspending the budget all the time. But remember, this could actually be a risk to the overall quality of your project if people are cutting corners to underspend. Okay? So in the sense here, you might actually find that to be a trigger where you're constantly seeing that. Of course, that means the other side of it as well. You find people constantly overspending on the budget. That's also an indicator or a trigger that something else may be going wrong too. So being able to have something like that and plan that out where you have it where it's essentially going to tell you in your plan at some point, here's some triggers that you need to look for, and then you might find out that you do have to actually use either quantitative or qualitative analysis to help you out as well. Okay? The other thing, of course, is examining the results of risks afterwards. Okay? So when you start to take a look at the idea of examining, what you might find out, okay, is that whatever assumption that you had about a particular risk is wrong, okay, and then that way you update your particular project to help you out and to try and find that. Now, when you start to review that, you'll also end up updating the actual risk register. Now, I have an example of a very basic risk register I want to show you. So just as we've taken a look at earlier here, so this is normally what a basic risk register also looks like as well, okay? You not only have the risk score, but you also have the plan and who's actually going to own that particular risk to help us out. So you might find out that you already have some risk plans, for those that you have to do. And you simply enter that in as far as the name here. And so you might say response plan 1. Oops, if I can spell it. Plan 1. So you might have something like that. And then you actually assign who the owner is going to be.
Yay.
There you go. Okay. And then this way, when it comes down to whatever risk C is, if it does happen, because we're actually saying, what, this is a high probability, high impact, we now have a plan of action that we go to that risk register and we find that out. We know exactly what plan and who owns it. Cherokee is supposed to be following what? Plan 1.
Plan 1.
Yep, and whatever that is, okay?
Yeah.
That's what's supposed to be done there.
Got it.
And the reason why that's important is because it actually provides accountability as well. And so when we start doing that, Plan 1 includes, of course, the ideas here of policies and procedures that are in place in terms of the response itself, ensures that we have the contingencies in place that we need to. After the risk is over, we might find out that we don't have to deal with that risk anymore, so we update the plan as well as this risk matrix here, where we might even mark out all of risk C because it's now done and over. But if you do have a risk that's going to be constantly repeating, you might not, but you might see that the probability and the impact is going to change over time too. So there is a lot available to us when we start to take a look at the idea of having to manage risk effectively too, okay? Once you have everything in place, you might find out that reprioritization and prioritization, okay, is going to depend on the idea of what happens with the risk and the resource availability, okay? So you might find out that you're ready for something like a drill, an emergency management drill, in terms of relocating people from one particular location to another, but you might find out that you're poorly staffed for something like a fire happening and not being ready and not being drilled on people putting on their mask and getting people out of the building. So that's when you actually have to reprioritize things, you know, based on some experience that you've had with it and based on some other information. And lastly, of course, there has to be a great communication plan already in place with handling the idea of risk. If you don't have communications about risk, people will generally not tell you, okay, and you won't tell them, and that means everybody will treat the risk differently in the way that they feel like is best, and now you'll have 3 or 4 different plans of actions in place, and they may end up contradicting one another. So always make sure you provide and communicate to the stakeholders along with the proper communication channels what the risk is, what has happened or what is about to happen, and why it has to be dealt with as well, okay? So overall risk management, it takes a bit of time. It's a lot more to it than what we've just went over at this particular point, but it is something that you definitely need to keep a track of. Because once you stop doing it and you go, I don't have to worry about this anymore, that's the time you should be worried that risk is going to happen because nobody's tracking it. So make sure you go over these concepts very well, because this is kind of the big part of project management and where project management can go wrong if you're not actually taking a look at the idea of managing risks effectively.
Ronnie, I think you did a really great job of showing us where to start, how to look at certain tools to help us identify those risks, the impact of those constraints and those influences, and I think that about sums it up for this episode. So thank you guys for tuning in. I appreciate that. Stay tuned because there's more Project Plus headed your way. I'm Cherokee Boose.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing out. Have a great day.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.